One moment I thought I had everything: family, love, a place in the world. I had spent my life building something for myself and my son, Jake. We were a team, or at least that's what I believed. Every sacrifice I made, every long hour of hard work, was all for him. I thought our bond was unbreakable, forged through years of laughter, struggle, and shared dreams. But everything changed in an instant. One day, without warning, the very person I trusted most, the one I gave everything to, turned on me in a way I could never have imagined. It wasn't a dramatic argument or a blowout fight. No, it was quieter, more insidious, like a slow poison that crept into our relationship and destroyed it from the inside out. Jake, my son, asked me to leave. He said I was in the way of his relationship with his new girlfriend, Sarah. He told me it was time for me to go, as if my presence had become an inconvenience. It felt like the ground beneath me had vanished. For the first time in years, I was completely alone. I couldn't understand it. How could the child I had raised, the one I had always been there for, so easily cast me aside? That moment shattered everything. Not just the walls of our home, but my entire sense of self. I had always thought family meant something more, something that lasted. But in the blink of an eye, I learned that sometimes the people we love the most can hurt us the deepest, and I was left to pick up the pieces of my life, unsure of what to do next. David had always believed that family was the bedrock of everything. From the very first day Jake was born, his life shifted entirely. The sleepless nights, the long hours, at work, the moments of sacrifice. David did it all with a single thought in mind: to give his son a life that was better than his own. His hands, calloused and worn from decades of hard labor, had built more than just a house. They had built a life, a modest yet loving home where memories were forged with each passing year. For years, David woke up every day with a sense of purpose, knowing that the struggles he faced would ultimately be worth it if they led to Jake's happiness and security. As a child, Jake was the light of his world. David remembered the early mornings spent teaching him how to ride a bike, the afternoons spent playing catch in the yard, and the quiet evenings when they would sit on the porch, sharing a beer and talking about everything and nothing. These small, seemingly insignificant moments were the foundation of their bond. To David, family wasn't about wealth or status. It was about trust, loyalty, and the love they shared. It was about knowing that no matter what life threw at them, they had each other. David's dreams had never been grand. He wasn't looking for fame or fortune. His dream was simple: to provide for Jake, to make sure his son had the opportunities he never had, to be the kind of father who would always be there when Jake needed him. And for years, that was enough. They had a small but comfortable home, a place where laughter echoed through the halls, where Jake's friends would come and go, bringing with them the energy and joy that filled David's heart. The walls of that house weren't just made of brick and mortar. They were made of shared moments, love, and sacrifices that had weathered the storms of life. David's work had been grueling, a constant struggle to make ends meet. But through it all, he found solace in the idea that his efforts weren't for nothing. He put in the long hours at the factory, worked late into the night to finish projects around the house, and did everything he could to ensure Jake had a roof over his head and food on the table. In the quiet moments after a hard day's work, he would look at Jake with pride, knowing that every drop of sweat was a step closer to giving him the future he deserved. But no matter how hard David worked, or how much he sacrificed, there were things beyond his control, things he couldn't have predicted. Life had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected it, and David was about to face one of the hardest blows he could ever imagine. The shift started slowly, almost imperceptibly. Jake, once a kid who would sit by his side and share his hopes and dreams, had begun to change. David noticed it in the way Jake began spending more time with his friends, then later in the way he started dating Sarah, a girl David had never met. It wasn't that David was opposed to Sarah. It was simply that he could sense the growing distance between him and Jake, a gap that seemed to widen with every passing day. At first he told himself it was just a phase. Jake was growing up, becoming his own person as young people do. But the distance continued to grow, and before long it felt like a wall had been built between them. The days Jake spent at home grew fewer, replaced by nights out with Sarah. David would come home from work to an empty house, the quiet echoing in the spaces that once buzzed with life. He missed his son's laughter, the sound of him running up the stairs, the chatter about school and friends. Instead, the house felt like a shell of what it once was, empty and hollow, a stark contrast to the warm and lively home it had been. David tried at first to bridge the gap. He would invite Jake to sit down for a meal together, or ask about his day, but Jake's answers were short and distracted. The conversations they had once shared were now strained, filled with awkward silences. And then one evening, when David came home from work, he found a note on the kitchen table. "Dad, I need you to move out. It's not that I don't care, but Sarah doesn't like you here. I think it's time for you to go." David stood there, staring at the note, his heart sinking. The words didn't make sense. He had given everything for Jake, his time, his energy, his heart, and yet, in that moment, it felt as though all of it had been erased. How could his own son, his flesh and blood, ask him to leave? And why? Was he really in the way of Jake's relationship with Sarah? Was this what it had come to? David didn't know what to think. He felt betrayed, but more than anything, he felt hurt. The home that had once been filled with laughter and memories now felt like a cold, foreign place. The warmth, the love, that had once made it special, had faded, and in its place was an unbearable emptiness. He couldn't understand it. Jake, the child he had raised, the one he had poured everything into, had just asked him to leave as if he was nothing more than an inconvenience. He packed his things in silence, the weight of the betrayal too heavy to bear. As he walked out the door, the house seemed to close behind him, as though it was no longer his. It wasn't just the loss of the physical space, it was the loss of everything that had made that house a home. The memories, the laughter, the moments they had shared. David had never imagined something like this could happen. He had always believed that family was supposed to be forever, that no matter the struggles, no matter the hardships, you could always count on each other. But in that moment, he realized how fragile those bonds could be, how quickly they could break. And as he walked away from the house, from the life he had built, a deep sense of loss settled within him. But it was more than just losing a house. It was losing his place in the world, the one place he had always believed he truly belonged. The first sign of the shift came subtly, like a whisper in the wind that David couldn't quite place. At first, it was just an offhand comment, something Jake had said casually one evening after dinner. They were sitting together, the way they always had, sharing a meal and talking about their days. Jake mentioned Sarah, his girlfriend, and then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "Sarah doesn't really like you being around so much, Dad." The words didn't hit David immediately, but something in them lodged itself in his chest like a splinter. At first, he brushed it off, telling himself it was just a passing remark, something that didn't mean much. After all, it was natural for Jake to have a relationship outside of their family bond. But even then, David couldn't shake the discomfort that settled in his stomach. The thought that someone he didn't even know, could have a say in his presence in his own home felt like an intrusion. As the days passed, those small comments became more frequent. Jake would talk about Sarah and how she was uncomfortable with David hanging around too much. It was always framed as a suggestion, never an outright demand, but the implications were clear. Jake was growing more and more distant, and Sarah's opinions seemed to be taking precedence over their own relationship. David could sense the subtle shift in Jake's behavior, a coldness that began to creep in where there used to be warmth. It wasn't obvious at first. Jake still came home, still spent time with David, but there was something different. The easy conversations they once shared became awkward, filled with silences where there used to be laughter, and when David did try to engage, Jake's responses were curt, distracted, and often lacking the affection he had once shown. David, ever the patient father, told himself that it was just a phase. Jake was growing up after all, and relationships could change as people got older. He told himself that he needed to give Jake space, that it was normal for him to pull away a little as he figured out who he was outside of his relationship with his dad. But it was hard to ignore the growing distance between them. He could feel it in the way Jake no longer sought his advice, in the way he would disappear for days wrapped up in his life with Sarah, leaving David alone in a house that once felt full of life. There were moments when David would come home from a long day's work, expecting to hear Jake's voice or see him at the dinner table. But more often than not, Jake wasn't there. The house that had once been a lively hub of activity, filled with the sounds of their everyday life, had become eerily quiet, the only noise the creak of the floorboards beneath David's feet. David tried again and again to reach out. He would make dinner, hoping to draw Jake back into the fold, hoping for a chance to reconnect. He would leave messages, check in, offer to watch a game together, but more often than not, Jake would be too busy. Or if he was home, he was distracted, his phone glued to his hand, his thoughts elsewhere. David didn't want to be the father who pushed, who hovered, so he tried to stay patient. But each time Jake's attention turned elsewhere, a pang of loss struck David's heart. It wasn't just the absence. It was the way Jake seemed to slip further away, leaving David to grapple with the growing sense that his son no longer needed him. Then came the day David would never forget, the day Jake asked him to leave. It was a Saturday morning, a quiet, unremarkable morning at first. David had just finished his coffee and was getting ready to start the day when Jake approached him. There was an odd hesitation in his son's eyes, a look David hadn't seen in a long time. It was like a door had opened, and through it, the uncomfortable truth came rushing in. "Dad, I think it's time for you to go," Jake said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Sarah doesn't want you here anymore. She feels like you're in the way. She wants us to have our space, just the two of us." David stood frozen, his heart beating wildly in his chest. The words hit him like a slap to the face, in the way. He couldn't believe it. He felt a sudden overwhelming rush of emotions, hurt, confusion, disbelief. This wasn't how he had imagined it would happen. There was no warning, no conversation, just this cold, impersonal demand. He searched Jake's face for some trace of the son he had raised, the boy who had once idolized him, but all he saw was a stranger, a person who had made a choice, a decision that David had never anticipated. Jake didn't even look at him as he spoke. His eyes were cast downward as though the words were nothing more than a simple matter of fact. In the way. The weight of that statement hung in the air, suffocating David. He wasn't just being asked to leave, he was being erased. The life they had built together, the years of sacrifice and love, all of it was being dismissed. David had worked so hard to give Jake everything, to build a life for them both, and now, in the span of a few sentences, it felt like none of it mattered. David tried to reason with him, but Jake's mind was made up. "It's not personal, Dad. It's just that I need to focus on my relationship with Sarah. You don't understand how important this is." The words stung more than David could have ever anticipated. He had been there for every step of Jake's life, offering guidance, love, and a steady presence. And now he was being pushed aside as if he were some unwanted guest in his own home. The silence that followed was deafening. David felt his legs buckle beneath him, but he steadied himself against the table. He couldn't believe this was happening. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He had done everything right. And yet, it was clear that the bond they once shared had been replaced by something new, something that didn't include him. David packed his bags that day, his hands shaking, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He felt like a failure, like he had done something wrong even though he had sacrificed everything for his son. He walked out the door, leaving behind the home he had worked so hard to build, leaving behind the life he had given his all to. As he stepped into the world outside, the weight of abandonment settled heavily on his chest. This wasn't just about a house. This was about being discarded, about losing the one thing that had given his life meaning: family. David's world had crumbled in an instant. The moment Jake had asked him to leave, it felt as though the very ground beneath his feet had given way. He couldn't even begin to process it. His son, the one he had raised and loved with every ounce of his being, choosing to cast him aside for a girl he barely knew. It wasn't just the act of being asked to leave. It wasn't just the sting of rejection or the hurtful words. It was the realization that everything David had worked for, every sacrifice he had made, every drop of sweat that had stained his shirt, had been reduced to nothing. David sat alone in his car that day, parked on a quiet street corner. The air outside was still, heavy with a kind of silence that matched the emptiness he felt inside. He stared through the windshield, not really seeing the world outside, but lost in the storm of his thoughts. How could this happen? How had it come to this point? He had always believed in family, had always believed that no matter what, they would have each other. They would stand together, no matter the circumstances. But now, all of that seemed like a lie, a fantasy he had clung to for far too long. He thought about the years he had spent working late into the night, the moments he had missed with friends, and even his own personal happiness, just so he could make sure Jake had everything he needed. He thought about the holidays spent together, the countless hours of fatherly advice, the pride he felt when Jake graduated high school, and when he saw his son off to college. Every moment of his life had been wrapped up in Jake's future. It had always been about Jake. But now none of it mattered. David's phone had started buzzing with messages from friends and family, people who had heard what had happened, asking if he was okay, offering support. But what could they say? How could they understand the deep, unshakable pain he felt? It wasn't just the fact that Jake had asked him to leave. It was the crushing weight of the abandonment. In that moment, David realized that everything he thought he knew about loyalty, love, and family had been shattered. His son had chosen someone else over him. It wasn't just Sarah. It was the idea of family that Jake had replaced with the shiny promise of youth and new love. In one fell swoop, David's lifetime of dedication had been reduced to nothing more than an inconvenience, an obstacle to his son's happiness. David ran his fingers over the old family photos on the dashboard, pictures of Jake as a child, laughing, playing with his father by the lake, and posing for family portraits. Each photo seemed to mock him now. He had given his all to build a family, to raise Jake in a way that would make him proud. But in the end, it wasn't enough. He was nothing but a shadow in the life Jake had built with Sarah. He knew deep down that he wasn't the one to blame. He had always been there, always provided, always loved. But that knowledge offered no comfort. The pain of betrayal and abandonment cut deeper than anything he had ever experienced before. The house that had once been a home now felt like a tomb, a place where his heartache reverberated off the walls, echoing louder and louder as the days went by. With nothing left to hold on to, David began to question everything he had known about family. What was the point of all his sacrifices if they could be erased so easily? What was the point of loving so deeply if the love could be so easily discarded? How had he failed Jake, when all he had ever wanted was to help him become the best version of himself? It was in these quiet, painful moments that David began to wonder if everything he had believed in was a lie. His life had been centered around the idea of family, but now that very idea was falling apart. There was no guidebook for how to handle the grief of losing someone you thought you'd never lose, especially when that someone was your own child. The loneliness that David felt was unbearable. He had always been strong, resilient, the one people came to when they needed help, the one who held things together. But now, in the solitude of his car, he felt small. He was a man with nothing but broken dreams and the painful remnants of a relationship that had once meant everything. It was hard to breathe, hard to think, and even harder to understand why this had happened. As the days passed, the world around him moved on, oblivious to the internal struggle that consumed David's every waking moment. He could see Jake and Sarah's lives blossoming, their bond growing stronger while David stood on the sidelines, a man out of place in the world he had once been a part of. They would go out to dinner, post pictures online, and create new memories, while David, heartbroken and defeated, sat in his empty apartment, struggling to come to terms with what had happened. The pain of watching his son, the boy he had raised, replace him with someone else, was unbearable. But what hurt even more was the nagging question that haunted him constantly. Why had he not been enough? David's sorrow ran deeper than just the loss of his home or his space. It was the loss of his identity. His entire life had been wrapped up in being a father. Now he had no role. He had no purpose. The very thing that had defined him was no longer there. He didn't know who he was without it, and that was perhaps the most painful realization of all. While David struggled with the painful reality of his new life, Jake and Sarah seemed to flourish in ways that David couldn't have anticipated. It was as though the universe had shifted for them, placing all their dreams and aspirations in perfect alignment. To David, it felt like a cruel twist of fate. He had sacrificed so much for his son's happiness, and now, Jake seemed to have found everything he needed in someone else. David would occasionally hear snippets of their life together through mutual acquaintances, though it pained him to even listen. He learned that Jake had moved in with Sarah, that they were planning trips together, buying new things for their shared home. They were making memories while David sat alone in the silence of his apartment. It was like watching a different version of the son he once knew, a son who had completely transformed, leaving behind the family he had once valued, and embracing a new world that David could never be a part of. Jake posted photos online, moments from their life together, vacations, meals, laughter, and David would see them, scrolling through the endless pictures of smiles of happiness. But what hurt the most was the realization that David was now a distant memory, someone who no longer mattered. He was being erased from the narrative of his son's life, replaced by Sarah and their shared experiences. Jake seemed happier than ever, and David couldn't help but feel a twinge of jealousy. His son had found someone who made him feel seen, someone who was now his priority. David understood that relationships change, that they grow, evolve, and sometimes new people enter the picture. But there was something deeply painful about watching Jake move on, while David remained stuck in the past, unable to shake the feeling of being discarded. It wasn't just the social media posts or the photos. It was the very essence of what had happened. Jake had built a life with Sarah, a life that didn't include him. There was no room for David in their world anymore. He was just a shadow of what he had once been, relegated to the background while the new, shiny version of Jake emerged. But it wasn't just about the physical absence. It was the emotional abandonment that cut the deepest. David had always believed that no matter how much life changed, family would remain constant. But now, he saw that family wasn't always forever. It wasn't guaranteed. Jake had found someone to take his place, someone who offered him a fresh start, someone who didn't carry the weight of years of sacrifice and love. And while David was left to grapple with the fallout, Jake and Sarah's bond continued to grow, leaving David to wonder if he had ever really mattered at all. Instead of crumbling under the weight of betrayal, something shifted deep within David. The emotional fog that had clouded his thoughts began to clear, and in its place, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: freedom. At first, the anger had consumed him, a constant companion that gnawed at his insides. He had been hurt, devastated, and confused by the rejection, by the loss of everything he had worked for. But as the days passed, the anger faded, and what remained was a quiet, simmering resolve. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. David had spent so much of his life putting others first, making sure that Jake had everything he needed, that the world had what it demanded from him. But now, with nothing left to hold him back, David found the courage to focus on himself. He had spent years sacrificing his own dreams, his own desires, in the name of family. But now, in the painful void of his son's absence, David realized something crucial. He still had the power to shape his own future. He didn't need Jake's approval or anyone's validation. The time had come to finally invest in himself, to build something he could be proud of, something that would stand as a testament to his strength, to his ability to rise from the ashes of his old life. David took his savings, the small amount of money he had tucked away, and began looking into ways to invest. The idea of starting something new, of building something from the ground up, thrilled him. For the first time in years, he felt alive with possibility. It wasn't just about making money, it was about reclaiming his independence, his dignity, his sense of self. He didn't need to rely on anyone else. He didn't need to play the role of the dutiful father anymore. The thought of creating something on his own, something that was entirely his, was exhilarating. The first few steps weren't easy. David knew that starting over, especially at his age, wouldn't be simple. But there was something deeply satisfying about the challenge. He threw himself into his new venture with a tenacity he hadn't known he still had. He poured his energy into learning everything he could about the business he was starting. He read books, watched videos, talked to experts, anything he could do to arm himself with knowledge. The years of hard labor he had put in working for others had taught him the value of effort. But this was different. This was about building something that had his name on it, something he could claim as his own. As the weeks passed, David began to see the fruits of his labor. There were setbacks, of course. No venture worth having was ever without its challenges, but each setback only fueled his determination further. He worked late into the night, sitting at a small desk in his apartment, scribbling plans, calculating risks, and making calls to potential partners. There were times when he felt overwhelmed, when doubt crept in, whispering that he was too old, too late to be starting something new. But each time those thoughts appeared, he pushed them away, reminding himself that he had nothing to lose. And slowly, little by little, things began to fall into place. The visual imagery of David's journey began to take shape, like a montage unfolding before him. The camera would show him hunched over a desk, a pencil in hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. It would cut to him shaking hands with a new business partner, the look of determination in his eyes unmistakable. Next, he'd be out in the field, overseeing the first steps of his project. He was taking risks, embracing the uncertainty of building something from scratch. And with each success, no matter how small, David's confidence grew. The man who had once been reduced to a shadow of himself, abandoned and heartbroken, was now standing tall once again. The tension between David and Jake slowly faded into the background as David's focus shifted from the past to the future. Jake's absence no longer felt like a gaping wound. Instead, it was a reminder that David didn't need anyone else to define his worth. He had built a life once, and now he was building it again, on his terms. The pain of losing his son had not gone away, but it had been transformed. It was no longer a weight that dragged him down, but a fuel that pushed him forward. He had been broken, but in that brokenness, he found a strength he hadn't known he had. David's eyes, once filled with confusion and sorrow, now burned with resolve. He was no longer the man who had been cast aside, discarded by the very person he had loved most in the world. He was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had rediscovered his sense of purpose. There were still moments when doubt crept in, when the loneliness threatened to overwhelm him. But David had learned something invaluable in those quiet moments. He didn't need anyone's approval to be successful. He didn't need Jake's love or validation. He had something far more important, his own belief in himself. And that belief was what would carry him through. David's journey wasn't just about business. It was about reclaiming his life. The realization that he could stand on his own, that he could rise from the ashes of his past, was both liberating and empowering. It was a victory, not over Jake or Sarah, but over the doubts that had held him captive for so long. With each passing day, David became more and more confident in his new venture. He no longer felt like a man broken by betrayal. He was a man, reborn, ready to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead. There were still hard days, moments of loneliness when the weight of the past felt unbearable, but they no longer had the power to define him. He had taken control of his own future, and that was all that mattered. David had started over, and in doing so, he found something he had lost long ago: himself. Months passed since David had walked away from the life he once knew, months of silent work, of painstaking effort, and of transformation. His new business was thriving slowly but surely. He had built something from nothing, an empire as he now saw it. It wasn't about wealth or success in the traditional sense. It was about reclaiming his self-worth, about finding the strength to rise from the ashes of what he thought was his last chapter. The small apartment where he now lived had become more than just a space to exist. It was a symbol of everything David had accomplished on his own. He woke up every day with purpose, with drive, and with a quiet pride. The satisfaction of knowing that, despite being discarded by the one person he had loved most, he had not only survived but thrived, was intoxicating. David had learned to appreciate the simple things: his independence, his newfound strength, the joy of knowing he was no longer dependent on anyone else to define his happiness. But as David was building this new life, Jake, on the other hand, was struggling. Life had not been as kind to him as he had imagined. His relationship with Sarah, once so full of promise, had begun to unravel. They were no longer the perfect couple posting carefree pictures on social media. There were arguments, frustrations, and an undeniable distance between them. Jake's life had started to feel like a house of cards, each moment a fragile piece ready to collapse. It was late one evening when David heard a knock on his door. He wasn't expecting anyone. His life had become quiet, calm, and predictable. At first he thought he might be imagining it, but when the knock came again, more insistent this time, he stood up and walked toward the door. His heart rate quickened as he opened it, and standing in front of him was none other than Jake. The son he had raised, the one who had thrown him out, now stood before him, looking different, older, more worn down. There was a hesitance in Jake's eyes, a mix of guilt and uncertainty that hadn't been there the last time they spoke. Jake's jaw was tight, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets as if to shield himself from the vulnerability of the moment. But it was clear. Jake had come to David, and the tension between them was palpable. David didn't know what to expect. He didn't know what had brought Jake to his door after months of silence. He couldn't help but notice the differences in him. The youthful confidence Jake once had was gone, replaced by something that looked more like regret. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a look that told David everything he needed to know. Jake had come not just for answers, but for redemption. Jake stood there for a moment, his words stumbling out as he tried to find the right ones. "Dad, I didn't know where else to go," he said, voice low. "Things with Sarah, it's not working out. I messed up, and I need your help." David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took in the scene before him. The son who had once cast him aside was now standing at his door asking for help. The irony wasn't lost on him. Jake had rejected him when he needed him the most, but now, months later, here he was, reaching out to the man he had abandoned. For a moment, David felt a flicker of anger, a rush of old resentment. He had worked so hard to rebuild his life, to stand tall again, and now Jake, the one who had shattered everything, was asking him to pick up the pieces. It was easy to feel a sense of betrayal, to give in to the hurt that was still there, buried deep. But David knew better. He had come so far. He wasn't the same man who had walked out of the house with nothing. He had gained something far more valuable than any material success. He had gained control over his own destiny. Instead of responding with anger, David stood still, the weight of the moment settling around them. He looked at Jake, his son, standing there in front of him, and felt a strange calm wash over him. This wasn't the time for bitterness. This wasn't the moment to lash out. There was no need for a fight. David had learned that the only way forward was through strength, through quiet resolve. "You've come a long way to ask for help," David said, his voice steady. He studied Jake for a moment, trying to read him, to understand the boy who had once been so full of life and now seemed so hollow. "But I can't be the one to fix things for you. You have to fix them yourself." The silence hung thick between them, the tension between father and son more pronounced than ever. But as David looked into Jake's eyes, he realized something. This wasn't about helping Jake get out of a jam or fixing his broken relationship. This was about something deeper. This was about respect, about understanding the lessons that time had taught them both. David didn't move to open the door any wider. He didn't offer Jake a seat or ask what had gone wrong with his relationship, though he could see the pain in his son's eyes. It wasn't the time for that. Instead, he stood firm, watching as Jake shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable, in the silence. The once vibrant young man was now a shadow of the person David had known. There was no longer any bravado in Jake's posture, no more cocky smile. His shoulders were slumped, as if he carried the weight of 1,000 regrets. But David wasn't going to let that cloud the truth. Jake had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. David knew that Jake hadn't just come for help. He had come because he had realized something crucial. It wasn't just Sarah that he had lost. It was the foundation of everything that had once been meaningful to him. It was his family, his connection to the one person who had always been there for him. In his pursuit of something new, Jake had pushed his father aside, but now, facing the fallout of his own choices, he had come to the realization that the one person who could show him the way forward was the man he had cast aside. David looked at him, no longer with the eyes of a father who had been rejected, but with the eyes of someone who had rebuilt himself from the ground up. "You pushed me out, Jake," David said, his voice not laced with anger, but with quiet strength. "But in the end, it was the best thing that ever happened to me." Jake's eyes widened as the words hit him. He wasn't sure what to say. The realization, the weight of his father's words, settled on him like a brick wall. David wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't demanding an apology. Instead, he had stood tall, calm, collected, in a way that left Jake speechless. It wasn't what he expected. It wasn't what he thought he deserved. David took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Jake's. "I've spent my life putting everyone else first," he continued, his tone firm yet gentle. "But I've learned something. I don't need anyone's approval to be whole, not even yours." The tension between them didn't dissolve immediately. It wasn't an easy resolution. But in that moment, Jake understood. He had come to his father seeking answers, but instead, David had shown him the most valuable lesson of all: self-reliance, quiet dignity, and the strength to move forward even when everything seemed lost. And for the first time, Jake felt a deep sense of respect for the man standing in front of him. The realization hit Jake like a ton of bricks, heavy and unyielding, as his father's words echoed in his mind. David wasn't just someone to be discarded, someone whose presence could be swept aside in the name of new beginnings. David hadn't just survived the heartbreak of being rejected by his own son. He had thrived. And as Jake stood there, the weight of his actions pressing down on him, he could no longer ignore the truth. He had treated the one person who had always had his back, the man who had given him everything, as disposable, like a burden to be cast aside when a new relationship came into his life. The thought of it gnawed at him, making his stomach churn, with guilt and regret. Jake hadn't fully understood the consequences of his actions until this very moment. All this time, he had been so focused on himself, so caught up in the whirlwind of his own life and the excitement of his relationship with Sarah, that he had failed to see what was happening to his relationship with his father. He had assumed that David would always be there, that no matter what, his dad would wait for him to come around, always there with open arms. But what Jake hadn't accounted for was David's quiet strength, the resolve that had been building in his father. Over the months, the fire that had fueled David's transformation. Jake had pushed him out, and instead of crumbling, David had found something within himself that Jake never expected: independence, resilience, and self-worth that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. David stood before him, a man who was no longer defined by the expectations of others, least of all his own son. He had not let Jake's rejection shape him. He hadn't let the betrayal fester into resentment. Instead, he had built something new from the wreckage of his past. David was no longer the man who had been discarded. He was stronger, more self-assured, and completely unshackled from the need for validation. Jake could see it now, in the way David held himself, in the way his eyes gleamed with quiet confidence. David had finally reclaimed his dignity. His sense of self, and the weight of that realization hit Jake harder than anything else. David's lack of resentment spoke volumes. The absence of anger, the calmness in his demeanor was the ultimate testament to his growth. There was no bitterness in his voice, no desire to make Jake feel guilty for the past. David had long since let go of the hurt. He had turned that pain into something far more powerful: self-reliance and personal triumph. His life was no longer tethered to Jake's approval, no longer hinged on the love of someone who had cast him aside. David had done the hard work of rebuilding his life, not for anyone else, but for himself. He had proven to the world, and most importantly to himself, that his worth was not tied to anyone else's actions or perceptions. He was enough, just as he was. Jake, on the other hand, was grappling with a profound sense of loss. He had come to his father seeking help, expecting some form of reconciliation, some easy fix to the mistakes he had made. But David had given him something far more valuable: a mirror, a reflection of the consequences of his actions, and the painful realization that what he had lost could never be replaced. The love and devotion that David had given him over the years couldn't be bought back with an apology or a simple act of forgiveness. Jake had pushed David away in the name of his own desires, and in doing so, he had lost something irreplaceable. In that quiet moment, Jake understood the depth of his mistake. David wasn't interested in forgiveness, and this realization hit Jake hard. The truth was, forgiveness didn't matter in this case, not in the way Jake had imagined it. David's journey wasn't about reclaiming his son's love or seeking an apology. It was about something far deeper, showing the world and himself that his worth wasn't conditional. It wasn't something that could be taken away by a single person, no matter how significant that person might be in his life. David had discovered that his happiness and sense of purpose weren't dependent on the approval of anyone else. He didn't need Jake to validate him. He didn't need anyone to tell him he was worthy. David had already proven it to himself, and that was the most powerful thing of all. The conversation between father and son was not one of anger or confrontation. It wasn't a climactic moment of shouting or blaming. Instead, it was a quiet exchange, one that spoke to the deep emotional truths that neither of them had fully understood before. For David, it wasn't about trying to make Jake understand the depth of his hurt. It wasn't about making him feel guilty or shameful. David had already moved past that pain. He had learned to stand on his own, to be proud of who he was regardless of how his son or anyone else saw him. For Jake, it was a moment of reckoning. He could no longer deny what had happened or pretend that his actions hadn't had consequences. He had lost something irreplaceable: his father's trust, his father's respect, and no apology could change that. But it wasn't too late. The seed of understanding had been planted. He would have to work to rebuild that relationship, not just by asking for forgiveness, but by proving through his actions that he was worthy of his father's time and trust. Jake wasn't sure how that would look or if it would ever be possible to repair the damage he had done. But one thing was clear: he couldn't undo the past, but he could move forward and try to be better. Try to be the man his father had always believed he could be. David's journey had come full circle. He had begun in a place of despair, abandoned by the one person he thought would always be there for him. But now, standing tall and resolute, he had proven something far more significant than his ability to survive. He had proven his ability to thrive, to rise above the pain, and to create a life that was entirely his own. His worth was no longer dependent on the love or approval of anyone else. It was rooted in his own sense of self. He had discovered that his happiness, his dignity, and his future were his to shape. Jake, standing there in the doorway, felt the weight of it all. His father had not just survived, he had become something stronger than he could have ever imagined. David had reclaimed his life, and in doing so, he had shown Jake the most important lesson of all: that love, respect, and self-worth are earned, not given. And sometimes the hardest part is learning to let go and trust that, even in the face of the deepest pain, we can still rebuild and become something greater than we were before. Have you ever been pushed aside by someone you loved? Maybe it was a family member, a friend, or someone you thought would always be there for you. It's an incredibly painful experience, feeling like the person you've given so much to suddenly turns their back on you. But in those moments of betrayal, there's also an opportunity to find strength within yourself, an opportunity to reclaim your power and rise above the hurt. I'd love to hear your story. How did you handle the pain of being pushed aside? Did you find a way to rebuild, to find your own path forward? Or did it take time to realize your worth wasn't tied to someone else's actions? Life is full of challenges that test us, but it's how we respond to those challenges that shapes who we become. Whether you've found strength in the face of betrayal or you're still navigating that journey, your story is important. Sharing your experiences helps create a community where we can all learn from one another and find inspiration in each other's resilience. We're not alone in these struggles, and by speaking up, we empower others who may be going through something similar. So take a moment to reflect. How have you turned pain into power? What have you learned about yourself through difficult times? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you've gone through and how it's helped you grow. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of resilience, growth, and self-discovery. Let's keep supporting each other on this journey.